Very involved in helping coordinate it while Judy Cabell is still in
Good
the
evening.
provost office.
Not
I don't think it is.
You can they can have a good evening now. All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Chris LaFuria with Marketing and Communications at Edinboro. We welcome you tonight to the final Uncomfortable Conversations panel of the academic year. In February, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey unveiled a 14-page resolution that includes ideas aimed to address climate change, including public works projects, high-quality health care, access to clean water, and affordable food. We have a panel of faculty experts tonight that are going to address the Green New Deal with their academic areas, and after that we are going to open the floor up for questions. So we will be coming around with a microphone. If you have questions for any of our panelists, feel free to just raise your hand and we'll come around for you. Introducing the panelists tonight is our interim provost, Dr. Jim Fisher. So can we give him a round of applause, please?
Good evening, everybody. Good evening. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and we'll let them talk and talk with you. So our panelists, in order of the order in which they're going to speak, Dr. Jared Jenrette is a professor of history at Edinboro University, where she has taught and conducted research since 1992. Dr. Jenrette earned a bachelor's degree in history and theology from Mars Hill College, a Master of Arts in history from Appalachian State University, and a PhD in history from West Virginia University. Since fall 2014, she has been taking one online class each semester at the Chicago Theological Seminary, including courses on Jewish thought, Hebrew Bible, and Gospel and Women's Voices. Dr. Jenrette has taken students on academic and cultural trips since 1993, including trips to Salem, Massachusetts, Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and Charleston, South Carolina. Her most recent publication is a book chapter examining North Carolina women during World War I. Dr. Karen Eisenhart is an associate professor in the Geosciences Department of Edinboro University. She holds a PhD in geography from the University of Colorado Boulder, where she specializes in biogeography. Her research interests include long-term forest dynamics with a specialty in dendrochronology, which is the use of tree ring methods to understand forest-climate relationships and to discern long-term ecological patterns. For the last 15 years, she has taught environmental studies courses at Edinboro University, including conservation of natural resources, climatology, physical geography, forest geography, and conservation and environmental planning. She has a strong interest in conservation and environmental sustainability, and as a citizen of the earth, tries to practice what she teaches. Dr. Jingzi Jiang is an associate professor of economics at Edinboro University. She received her master's degree in statistics and her PhD in economics from Washington State University and a bachelor in finance degree from Shanghai University. Her passion for sustainability influences many areas of her life and inspires her to pursue challenging research projects. Her pursuit to thoroughly understand economic theories and her strong qualitative and analytical skills have led her to produce high-quality research with high productivity. She has developed nationally recognized research projects in energy financial economics and environmental economics, which may potentially support the revitalization of older industrial cities. Dr. Jiang has made important policy and outreach contributions in environmental economics, especially plastic pollution reduction. And Dr. Jerry Jenlin is an associate professor of international politics at Edinboro University, where he has taught courses in Russian politics, American foreign policy, national security, terrorism and political violence, and American politics since 2002. Dr. Jenlin holds a PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He has held research and teaching positions at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, and the College of the Holy Cross. He maintains an active research agenda, presenting at national and regional conferences, and is regularly engaged by the media as an analyst of global affairs. So welcome to our panelists, and let's get started. Thank you.
Uncomfortable conversations. Well, it's uncomfortable in here tonight, right? Because it's hot. And they say there's no climate change. It's not a problem. So that's kind of what we're here to talk about. My job is to talk about history. Surprise. And so let's talk about the fact that the Green New Deal is not the first New Deal that we've had in American history. The world came to an end in 1929 when the stock market crashed and people felt their lives were falling apart. By March of 1993, 12 million Americans were unemployed. Out of a possible 50 million employable people. That's a lot of people. So what was the president, newly elected President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, going to do? So he decided to implement what he called his 100 days, where they introduced lots of new legislation. It's called the alphabet legislation, but that alphabet legislation extended well beyond that 100 days. One of the things that he did to try to restore faith in the country was he engaged in fireside chats to talk to America, to talk to the people about, don't worry, the banks are going to still be here. They're not going to close. They're not going to go away. Your money is safe. Don't go to the banks and pull it all out, because that'll just create more problems. So he did a lot to try to restore trust with the American people. So just to mention a few of the pieces of legislation that were implemented, and I would not suggest that all of it was effective, that it all had positive results, but a lot of it did. So here are some examples. One of the things that the Franklin Roosevelt administration felt that it was important to do was to restore people's faith in the economy. So, for example, they introduced the Federal Emergency Relief Agency to try to deal with victims of natural disasters, to help them get back on their feet. In 1935, the Social Security Act was introduced and passed. We still have that, at least for the foreseeable future, right? They also introduced something called the Security Exchange Act to regulate the stock exchange in hopes of ensuring that corruption would lessen. Also, the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, restored confidence in banks by promising people that if they put or left their $5,000 in the banks, it wasn't going to go away, it would still be there. One of the most significant pieces of legislation was what was called the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA. And this is basically where the federal government harnessed electric power in 7 or 8 states, really poor states, and provided employment for people, but also made sure that America's farmers in those states had what they needed. This caused a lot of concern among business interests, among power companies, private power companies, because if the government is taking over electric power and distribution of electric power, then what's going to happen to private corporations, okay? This also, certainly the TVA, the building of dams in different places, holding back water in places that were not accustomed to doing that, certainly affected farmlands. So some people would say that that was not a positive thing. The CCC, and I should make Chris come up here and talk to you because he has personal experience in his family history with the Civilian Conservation Corps, which targeted unemployment problems in America's cities. It employed 18 to 25-year-old men, and what they did was they went out and helped reclaim government-owned land and forest through irrigation, soil enrichment, pest control, tree planting, fire prevention, and other activities. They earned $1 a day, and they had to send part of that home to their families. Women were barred from the CCC because it was seen as a construction opportunity or construction jobs, and construction jobs were not deemed appropriate for women to engage in. The Works Progress Administration provided mostly construction jobs. It oversaw the construction or repair of more than 650,000 miles of roads. It built schools, libraries, recreational centers, and outdoor privies. Do you know what an outdoor privy is or was? It's a bathroom. It's a porta potty today. So they constructed these. In its first 6 years, the WPA spent $11 billion, 3/4 of it on construction and conservation projects, employing 8 million people. 8 million people. All of these pieces of legislation targeted white men. I have to say this, they targeted white men. Women were excluded in some cases. Immigrants were excluded. People who were Mexican were excluded. African Americans were included up to 10% in some cases, up to 15% in some cases. So there was no level playing ground in that regard. What else? Another piece of the WPA was the theater project. I have to mention this because the theater project is something that people don't often think about. So what it did was it provided entertainment to more than 60 million Americans, many of whom had never been to the theater. It also provided a program whereby African American children were taught to read and write, which increased the number of those children in primary schools in this country. And artists. Have you been in Cole Auditorium? Have you looked up at the ceiling? That is a WPA project. So if you haven't looked at it, when you are there the next time, look at it. So what else came about during this period was something called the Wagner Act. Faculty here are very appreciative of the Wagner Act because it gave workers the right to collective bargaining in this country. I want to mention one more. I don't know where I am with time, but that's okay. They've got a thing to like pull me off if I don't shut up. The least known plan was called the Ohio Plan. Started in June of 1934. It allowed state, local, and national relief administrations to reopen closed factories, rehire the workers that had lost their jobs, making products that they would then give to people who were on relief for free. Now imagine how this went over with business interests. It did not. Government-run factories began to pop up in many states and regions with plans to expand into coal mine areas, into quarries and canneries. But by the end of the year, the program was dead. It was killed under pressure from business interests. By the end of 1934, more than 20 million Americans, 1 out of 6, was receiving some kind of public assistance through this welfare state, and they were glad to be getting it. If I could just mention briefly, another kind of New Deal, it wasn't called the New Deal, was something called the War on Poverty under Johnson's administration in the 1960s. This War on Poverty program gave us initiatives like Head Start, community health centers, Medicare, Medicaid, the food stamp program, the National Endowment for the Arts, Upward Bound, and PBS. Those are things that are still in place. Social Security is still in place. So one of the things that I think is important as I sum up here is to indicate to you that historically there are times of national and global crisis when initiatives need to be taken to address pressing issues that are not going to go away. What if Roosevelt had not, with his administration, implemented all of that legislation? Where would those 20 million people have been by the end of the 30s? Thank you.
The 14-page resolution that Democratic Representative Ocasio-Cortez submitted to Congress begins with a reference to 2 recent reports on climate change and its impact. So all the things that Dr. Jenrette talked about are also integrated and wrapped up in the Green New Deal with climate change. So I thought I would just give you a little bit of context for that. The first report that's mentioned was published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in October of 2018. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, often referred to as the IPCC, was created in 1988 by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environmental Program. The IPCC does not conduct research. Rather, there are thousands of scientists and experts from throughout the world who volunteer their time to review and assess all of the available scientific, technical, and socioeconomic literature published each year, thousands of papers. The purpose of the IPCC is to provide all governments around the world at all levels with scientific information needed to develop climate policies. Their first assessment report was published in 1990, and they've produced a new assessment report about every 5 years. The 5th one was published in 2013, and the 6th one's due to be published in 2021. Each successive report from the IPP, starting in 1990, has become increasingly more certain of the role of human activities, particularly emissions of greenhouse gases in causing climate change. The report referenced in the resolution that we're talking about tonight was called a Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees C. The second report that's mentioned within the first paragraph of the Green New Deal resolution is the fourth National Climate Assessment Report. This National Climate Assessment is an interagency governmental effort to review the current status and predicted impacts of climate change to the United States. It's mandated for a report to be produced periodically by the Global Change Research Act of 1990. The fourth assessment report produced in the United States had over 300 experts contributing to it, and it was extensively reviewed by federal agencies and the National Academy of Sciences. Both of these reports by the IPCC and the National Climate Assessment strongly conclude that the climate is changing and that human activity is the dominant cause of observed climate change over the past century. I'm just going to read out a couple things from the 2-page highlight section at the very beginning of the 165-page National Climate Assessment. They mention this assessment concludes, based on extensive evidence, that it is extremely likely that human activities, especially emissions of greenhouse gases, are the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. For the warming over the last century, there is no convincing alternative explanation supported by the extent of the observational evidence. They list some of the observational evidence, which includes changes in surface, atmospheric, and oceanic temperatures, melting glaciers, diminishing snow cover, shrinking sea ice, rising sea levels, ocean acidification, and increasing atmospheric water vapor. They mentioned some specific parts of the United States. They mentioned problems of coastal flooding for 25 cities that are on the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf Coast, and they have regular daily tidal flooding that they didn't used to have. It specifically in the highlights mentions heavy rainfall increasing across the United States, especially in the northeastern United States, so you may have noticed that in our region. They mentioned that all of these trends are anticipated to continue and continue to get worse if we do nothing about that. Both the IPCC and the National Climate Assessment talk about how the current average global temperature, the temperature of the Earth averaged across the surface of it, has increased by 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels, time period of about 115 years ago. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it is responsible for all of these changes that we're seeing. And they predict that without major reductions in emissions, we could see, I don't know if I can include myself in this we, because by the end of the century I might not be here, but some of you may be. By the end of the century, there could be an increase of up to 5 degrees C above industrial levels. We've seen all these changes right now with just 1 degree C. They do mention, however, that with significant reduction in emissions, the increase in annual average global temperature could be limited to 2 degrees C or less. So certainly, there is a level of urgency for us to do what we can now to reduce greenhouse gases in order to limit warming and to avoid the most severe impacts of a changing climate. The longer we wait to take action, the more extreme the action needed will become. The climate actions that are listed in the Green New Deal resolution are ambitious, but they have to be. We need bold and ambitious visions. The Green New Deal presents goals. It's not the roadmap itself. Once the goals are set, then we can start working on how to achieve them. We have lots of options for strategies. Some strategies may include regulation. Some strategies could use economic tools like carbon taxes. Let's use all the tools in the toolbox. This is a serious issue. Unlike some of the negative spin produced by a part of the media, the Green New Deal does not call for a halt of all carbon emissions, but rather it calls for zero net emissions. So, anyway, okay, no tangents.
Oh, that's all right, go ahead. No
Okay,
fun if no
sorry.
tangents.
Zero net emissions means that any unavoidable greenhouse gas emissions will be offset in some way by removing carbon from the atmosphere. There are some natural processes that take carbon out of the atmosphere, including photosynthesis. Green plants use carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and long-lived plants like trees that can live for many, many decades or centuries, take that carbon and build it into the wood, so it's taken out of the system. There's also engineered solutions like carbon capture and then storing that carbon underground. Parts of the Green New Deal resolution mandate government to eliminate pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from various kinds of economic activities, but they also go on to say as much as technologically feasible. So we're not going to do away with beef cows. Hamburgers are safe. The resolution says it is the duty of the federal government to spur action on climate change, and I believe that this is true. The residential sector, according to the EPA, produces only 5% of the annual greenhouse gas emissions, whereas the transportation sector produces 29%. The electricity sector produces 28%. The industrial sector produces 22%. You and I turning off our lights and turning down our heat is not going to save the planet. But the government could bring about the level and spread of investment needed to reduce emissions in these other sections. The government is able to take on risks that the private sector may rightfully shy away from. So I personally commend the Democrats for bundling aggressive action on climate change with solutions to other pressing problems. I hope it spurs the Republican Party to bundle aggressive action on climate change with their favorite issues too. Climate change is not a Democratic issue. Climate change is not a Republican issue. Climate change is all of our issues, and it is the issue. We have to react to climate change by taking every opportunity we can to reduce emissions and to enhance carbon removal from the atmosphere.
You're well done. Good job. That felt like 2 minutes, but I bet it was 10. About. Maybe about 9.
So we have a really two great panelists discuss the history of the Green New Deal and also talk about climate change. So now being an economist sitting on the panel, and so some of you might think, she's going to talk about employment and the government budget, and will I?
No.
Yeah, of course. I don't want to disappoint you guys. I will talk about it. But first of all, I want to mention this. So actually, if you really look at the whole Green New Deal, for me, I actually found there economics actually got there's a lot of economics involved in the Green New Deal beyond employment and beyond the government budget. And so I want to ask you, how many of you taken any kind of economic class before? Great. So make my life easier. But for the people who never take any economic class, and I want to explain a little bit about economics. And so if you don't take economics, you will think, okay, economists only deal with money. And so I cannot see, no, I cannot see you're wrong. So you're right. So most of the time we are dealing with the money problems. And however, the fundamental problem we try to address is actually try to assist the decision maker and the stakeholder to decide how to best allocate the scarce resource. So actually it's about the decision making. And so that's why if you really got a chance to read the Green New Deals, this act, and you will find they talk about clean air, clean water, and also the fossil fuels. So actually, given the limited technology and clean air and clean water, so they are all considered as a scarce resource. And so when we are, people are debating about, arguing about clean energies. And so from economists' eyes, what they are debating is whether you should consume the clean air today or waiting for the future generation to consume those clean air and the clean water. And so for us to answer this question, it's not easy yes or no question. And actually, we'll go deeper to ask questions. And so should we, how much should we consume the clean energy, clean air, clean water today so that we will not suffer our current generation. At the same time, we want to save enough clean air and clean water so that our future generations will not be suffered. So that is what we are trying to figure out. So we try to figure out that the optimal points. So that's what economists try to answer. And so I will keep on my promise, and I will talk about a little bit about employment. And so as in my bio, Dr. Fisher mentioned about, I have a statistic background. So I love numbers and I love statistics. So that's why I will offer you a couple of numbers. So the first is I found the number from Bureau of the Labor Statistics. So the report is generated in April 2018. And so they report that the fastest employment growth from 2016 to 2026 is a solar panel installer. So their project, it will increase by 105%. And the second is the wind turbine service technicians. So the increase will be 96%. And also I visited the U.S. Energy Information Administration website to check on the solar energy consumption and the wind energy consumption. And so what I found is in 2008, so the solar energy consumption in 2008, which is about 10 years ago, so that is 4.52 trillion BTU. And the wind energy consumption is about 65.193 trillion BTU. And so 10 years later, 2018, and then the solar energy consumption is increased to 49.558 BTU, and which is about 996.17% increase. And the wind power energy consumption in 2018 increased to 228.71 trillion BTU, which has increased about 250%. And so the reason I citing these two numbers has two reasons. And so the first of all, as I mentioned in the Green New Deal, and they propose that the green industry will generate a lot of jobs, create a higher, solving the unemployment problem. So there is no question on that because the number talks, right? So the number talks. And however, I had a question on the time frame. So if you read the Green New Deal, they said that the Green New Deal goal should be accomplished through a 10-year national mobilization. So one of the goals is 100% of the power demand in the United States through clean, renewable, and zero-emission energy source. So I cannot see the 10 years too short or too long. And but what I want to emphasize is regarding of the employment. And so the right time length should achieve the Green New Deal should also consider how much time the skilled labor in the phasing out industry like fossil fuel industry. So how long will it take those people to get the skill to jump in these new industries? And so this is one of my questions. And unfortunately, they didn't mention that in their Green New Deals, but they didn't give more details. So I'm waiting to get more updates if they can push these acts forward. So that's what I want to see. And the second thing I want to point out is our higher education should be supported to play a role in helping those people to transit to the new industry by offering them training and education. Not just verbally say we support you, but also financially and also offer facilities and to help. We will play a very important role to help in this transition. And so I actually work on funded a project. I did a national survey to figure out people who currently work in the manufacturing industry on their attitude to working in the solar industry. So the feedback I got, the respondent I got a little bit heartbroken because they said they hesitate because they just worry they may not have opportunity to get skill to move into these new industries. And so, but the best part for this bill is they push our country to the good direction, And so if it will be passed, so I believe we will have a lot of funding to support this move. And so the second reason I citing those numbers is because you actually can see that most action proposed in the Green New Deal have already been implemented. So no matter it's solar energy or wind energy, they are growing before this bill is proposed. And also, we have numerous scientists and economists are studying the impact of climate change. And so my first time heard about a term called climate migrants is back to 2009. So the climate migrant means the people has to leave their country because their country is threatened by the rising sea levels. So they have to move to another country. So it's back to 2009. It's almost 10 years ago, people are already aware of the issues. And so, and also many corporations already start to take action to cut down their carbon footprint. So then the question is, why is Green New Deal will proposed? And so I think this should be a political question instead of an economic question. So therefore, I pass my microphone to Dr. Dillon.
Good evening. The Green New Deal consists of two sets of goals. One relates to climate change, the other relates to areas of social justice, and I'm going to talk about both of those in the political context, and if there's time, I will relate all of that to something else and make this a truly uncomfortable conversation by talking about Donald Trump, the Mueller report, and North Korea, if there's time. We've talked a lot about the environmental aspects of the Green New Deal, but the social justice part, I think, is just as important. For example, the Green New Deal seeks to guarantee a job with a family-sustaining wage, adequate family and medical leave, paid vacations, and retirement security to all people of the United States. Excuse me. The plan also advocates providing health care, affordable housing, economic security, access to clean water, air, food, and nature to all people of the United States. So it's an ambitious, vague, idealistic, maybe utopian plan, and it clearly appeals to the progressive left, but that's not such a bad thing by itself. So here are some facts that might help us put it into political context. First, on the environment. 73% of Americans believe that climate change is happening. That's an increase of 10 percentage points over the past 4 years. Only 14% of Americans say they don't believe that climate change is happening. And therefore, I think the discussion about whether climate change is real or not and people denying it and so on, I think that discussion is over, and the deniers have lost. The American people clearly believe that it's happening and that it's a problem that needs to be addressed. Since self-identified conservatives only make up about 35% of the population, liberals only 26%, it means that there's a lot of conservatives and a lot of moderates who do believe that climate change is real and it needs to be addressed. And that's particularly true of young people. Young conservatives, young moderates, not just young liberals, believe that climate change is something that we have to deal with. And that bodes well for the Green New Deal. But just because you agree that a problem exists doesn't mean you agree on the solution to that problem. You still have to convince people, especially conservatives, that there is a government solution to the problem and that the people need to make sacrifices in order to bring that solution into reality. For conservatives to accept that a problem has a government solution and that they have to make sacrifices, the people will have to be shown that the problem affects them personally somehow, that they are impacted by climate change and by other social justice issues raised in the Green New Deal, and that's where I see one of the problems. Here are some other facts on the social justice aspect. Take healthcare, for example. Most Americans rate their own healthcare coverage as good. 80% say the quality of their health care is good, and more than 2/3 of Americans are satisfied with their coverage. The number of people who view health care as an important issue in politics has actually declined. So to get conservatives and maybe even some moderates on board with a government solution to the healthcare problem, it's been difficult enough with Obamacare. It's going to be even more difficult if you try to propose something like Medicare for all. It's going to be very difficult when the status quo is working for most people. Third, 56% of Americans say the country is going in the wrong direction. Only 37% say it's going in the right direction. Actually, that's been the case for a long time. Most people have said for quite some time that the country is going in the wrong direction, no matter who's in control of Congress, no matter who's in the White House. People just are unhappy with the way the country's going, and you know what, they always have been. So it's not clear that that statistic alone indicates that they're going to support some ambitious proposals like those in the Green New Deal. Therefore, I conclude, I'm not done talking, I just conclude this section. I conclude that the Green New Deal requires a lot of persuasion of the American people, and persuasion takes leadership. So to gain any traction, the Green New Deal promoters have a significant leadership problem. They will have to convince Americans to go with them into a government solution to social problems that may not affect them personally, and that's a tall order. That can't be done by politicians on the far left, whose very names are already anathema to a broad section of the population. You can call something the New Deal and harken back to the Great Depression. But in 1932, as Dr. Jenrette pointed out, unemployment was already at 24%. A lot more people felt the effects of the Great Depression, and even people who didn't feel it personally could see it every day as they were walking down the street. It was more obviously, more salient in some communities than others, but everybody could see it, and everybody felt it, and that's not really the case with some of the issues in the Green New Deal. So there's a whole series of questions that point to the difficulty here. Some of them I've already raised. Is there a government solution to environmental and social problems? If so, how do you convince people who are suspicious of government to support that solution? How do you find massive amounts of government spending to fund it? How do you convince people who don't want to pay more in taxes that it's worth it to pay taxes? How do you convince people that society has a responsibility to its disadvantaged? How do you stop them from thinking, oh, those people just don't work hard enough. We don't have to take care of them. I work hard for my money. And I was actually, somebody asked me recently about why some conservatives don't want to take care of disadvantaged in the society. It was a student who asked me that. And I said, well, it isn't exactly like that, but consider for a moment that some of you are going to get extra credit for being here. How about if I just give extra credit to the entire class, even if they didn't show up? But you all showed up, you know. Or how about if I decided to give C's to everybody in class, whether they worked hard or not? Well, you probably wouldn't support that, even you liberals who work hard to get A's. So that's kind of the analogy that I raised to get them to understand that concept. So there's a lot of political questions involved here, and I'm going to address some of them in just a little bit more detail right now. First of all, the cost. I don't know. I don't know how much this thing is going to cost. The Green New Deal, does anybody know? And the reason we don't know is because it's really just a set of goals. As we said, there's no specific policy proposal. If my goal is to get healthy, that's a great goal. But how do I achieve that? It's one thing to say I'm going to get healthy. It's another thing to say I'm going to eat right and go to the gym 5 days a week. I'm not doing that. So that's just too much of a sacrifice. Even those of you who understand that eating right and exercising is important, you still don't do it. So if you can't do that for your own self, how are you going to do that for broader society? It's just hard to convince people to do those things. You can think about these things, since there's an economist in the room, in opportunity costs. You can think about what are we sacrificing in order to get it, or another way of sort of negative opportunity costs. If we don't address the problems of the Green New Deal, what's going to happen to us? What's going to happen to society? That's very hard to get through to people. You know, if you don't quit smoking, you run the risk of lung cancer. If you don't go to the gym, you run the risk of heart disease. We know that, and we still don't do the things we're supposed to do. We know the climate is changing, and still we don't recycle. We don't do those things we're supposed to be doing. So it's going to be a hard sell, I think. Secondly, politics. The Green New Deal comes across as a set of goals that liberals support. It's housed in the Democratic Party, and since a lot of people make their political choices and their ideological decisions based on partisan identification, you find people who are going to be against it from the get-go because it's a Democratic initiative. Some people simply identify as Democrats and they're going to support it no matter what. Some people identify as Republicans, they're going to oppose it no matter what. By my reckoning, it's about 20% of the people, maybe 25, who say, I'm a Democrat, I'm going to support anything Democrats do no matter what, and 20 to 25% say, I'm a Republican. No matter what Republicans are going to do, no matter who the Republicans nominate, I'm going to support that person no matter what. And then everybody in the middle, whom I hope are you, make their decisions based on issues, based on candidates, based on other factors besides narrow identification. But it is going to be hard to convince people to support something that is so identified with not just the Democratic Party, but the far left of the Democratic Party. The people who already identify themselves as, here's the S word, socialist. And that's going to be a difficult sell. I think that to really address these issues, if you really want to turn the Green New Deal into something practical, you have to be more functional. You have to come up with something that is actually doable. You have to take a step that people can support. You have to say something like, well, I don't know about eliminating oil from the economy in the next 20 years, but I do know that we can give subsidies to the solar industry, or we can give a tax break to people who buy a hybrid vehicle, tax breaks that don't expire, or something like that. That's a much more functional step that I think conservatives would support also, because it involves tax breaks, right? I think that the functional approach, advancing one policy at a time, also would work in the social justice aspect of it. I don't think Medicare for all is going to work. I think you need a private sector solution to social problems, which I think Obamacare was or is. I think it's actually a private sector solution. It's not socialism. It enshrines the role of insurance companies. What could be better in the private sector than making insurance companies bigger and more powerful? So that's the kind of thing I see working here. But you have a real psychological barrier, because a lot of the things that are proposed, even if you take a small functional step little by little, you still requires higher taxes. It still requires people to pay more, and it's a hard sell to get people to say, look, I have $50 in my pocket now, or I can give it to the government to distribute to environmental and social causes. I think I'll keep my $50. I think that's what a lot of people are going to say, which is why a lot of people supported the tax cut from a couple of years ago, because it put $50 in their pocket, and that's real money to people, right? I'll skip this part, and I'll get to the uncomfortable conversations part. My nickname for the Green New Deal is the re-election of Donald Trump, because I think the more the Democrats pull their own party to the left, and the more the socialist wing of the party, or the progressive wing, whatever you want to call it, takes over the party, the more moderates and disaffected Trump voters will shy away from it. I think that there are a whole lot of Republicans, more than you liberals think, who don't like Donald Trump, who wish they had an alternative and would actually vote for a Democrat if there was a Democrat they could support. But a Democrat who supports Medicare for all, getting rid of the insurance companies, large taxes and so on, is not going to get those voters to vote for them in 2020. So the more I think Bernie Sanders or someone like that pulls the party to the left, the more those people are going to say, no, that's scary, I'm voting for Donald Trump again in 2020. So I see the Green New Deal as simply the re-election of Donald Trump. The Mueller report, which came out today, which some of you may know about, doesn't really give the Democrats, not yet, enough to run on in 2020. They're going to need something else. They're going to need a positive agenda, which is what the Green New Deal is, or something really very negative. And if I were to advise the Democrats, and they haven't called me this year, but if I were, I would say, run on the negative. Run on the fact that Donald Trump's policy toward North Korea has been a failure. His economic policy has failed. His tariffs have failed. He's riding the wave of the Obama economic growth and so on. I would attack him negatively rather than trying to run on the positives of the Green New Deal, because that's too far to the left. So I really see it as a non-starter. I see it as threatening. I see it as scary to people. And I don't think the Democrats right now have the leadership to bring it into effect. Thank you.
All right. Before we start our Q&A, were there any comments from our panelists on each other's presentations or each other's comments for so far? If you go right into the Q&A.
I'd like to hear what students
Let's-
think. I'd like to hear just from the audience. I have some pet comments, but.
All right. Do we show of hands if we have questions from the audience? All right.
Is that okay?
Oh, yeah, it's fine.
Because we've been talking for like 45 or 50 minutes.
My throat got very.
This is specifically for Professor Genlin. Specifically, if they were to pull a lot of these ideas for pushing more renewable energy, and a shift in that energy sector with more or hard base numbers and ideas on how to actually accomplish that, do you think that that might actually gain some traction?
Are you asking whether people can be convinced by data, or I'm unsure what you're asking?
Because right now, when you were talking about it, one of the big issues that you cited was the fact that it's more a set of goals, not objectives. Like, these are the numbers that we want to see. These are the numbers that we can feasibly hit. Do you think if they actually pulled that out, made a different bill or something with with more hard numbers, that it could have a better result?
I think that broad sweeping proposals generally are very difficult to push through. The New Deal itself, as Dr. Jenrette pointed out, had a lot of opposition to it. And a lot of the policies were declared unconstitutional. Some of them didn't succeed. And the dirty secret of the Great Depression is that the New Deal didn't fix the Great Depression. It gave people hope. It had a lasting impact. Some of the policies remain and are very important. But it really didn't fix the Great Depression. Medicare also had a lot of detractors in the 1960s. The war on poverty didn't end poverty. Great, big, sweeping agenda items, both in the United States and elsewhere, just are very difficult to push through. So I would say the smaller the better. You know, if you really want to push these things through, be sneaky. Come up with policies that don't look like they are advancing broad sweeping goals, but take smaller steps along the way that people can support. And then they will, and then 10 years from now, you'll have achieved something.
Okay, so I'm wondering if, I guess my question is about taking small steps, because now everything's moving towards being sustainable socially, environmentally, economically. People are looking at like more holistic approaches, because when you address things separately, it becomes kind of like disjointed. So for example, the Sustainable Development Goals are sort of a similar, like very idealistic framework. What do all of you panelists see as the potential for the Green New Deal to be a similar sort of framework for maybe initiatives on a like more local level, whether it's state or citywide, like having an Edinboro Green New Deal or an Erie Green New Deal, and having it spread that way as opposed to like individual policies? Because I think in order to achieve something like this, it does need to be idealistic. I think it needs to be holistic. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I agree with you that it needs to be holistic, but it's maybe too scary. Like, I agree with you, but I can see also that would be very scary for people. But in terms of energy in our country right now, we have an aging energy grid, all these power lines that send energy hundreds of miles across the United States. That's all aging. We have nuclear power plants reaching the end of their lifetime, and we've not had new nuclear come on, and we are at this moment in time right now where we have to make decisions about whether to spend money patching things up and being stuck with the same kind of system, or whether or not we would have this broad vision and goals if we could craft a vision and goals that were attractive maybe to more people in the middle and towards the more conservative side of things, to sort of transform and revolutionize things into a new renewable energy economy. There could be different strategies to do that, but I just feel like we're at this critical moment in time where it's either we holistically change things in a big way with our investments, or we spend the same amount of money or more over time patching things along, and all the while there's this global climate change thing. I don't think global climate change will stand for piece by piece by piece. The longer we stretch that out, the worse things get. And then it will take bigger and bigger and bigger efforts to fix that. So I don't mean to be, that sounds very doom and gloom. I don't know what you guys think.
I think in Edinboro, Green New Deal is a great idea. I think that the things that start from the bottom and go up, I think, are much more likely to be successful and set a good example for elsewhere. If it starts in Edinboro, maybe Meadville will do something. And who knows, maybe Pittsburgh will do something. And then I think it'll spread that way. I think it's a very good idea. I was also, you may know a conservative senator from Tennessee, I think it's Lamar Alexander. He said, well, we don't need a Green New Deal. What we need is a new Manhattan Project, because everybody has to have a metaphor of some kind. We need sustained investment in something. Yeah. So I think investment is a good idea, but how do you get people to support it?
Yeah, I want to say something about the whole idea of vision. I think vision is important. If I can quote a scripture, without a vision, the people perish. And I think the ideals of the Green New Deal are what we need to look at, and then people who are smarter than I am, who have been elected to, not that all of them are, but those people who've been elected to public office that we have put our trust in, need to sit down, people from both sides of the aisle, and stop squabbling with each other and opposing something just because it comes from a particular political party, and have a serious conversation about where we're headed. The country has already, much of the country has already bought into the fact that we need something. Edinboro University, at the end of every email, don't print this, or think about this before you print it. Recycling cans in different places. I've been recycling for years. As long as I've lived in Edinboro, I've been recycling. And so I think the country gets it. I'm originally from North Carolina. Every time I drive down there, especially in the last 5 years, places that used to be clear pasture land or farmland, they're still farms, but they're solar farms now. I've been amazed at driving through conservative, rural North Carolina that all of these solar farms are being put up, and every time I go down there, which is every year, I see more and more. So I think the country, much of the country gets it. It's too bad Washington doesn't.
And so I agree with all the panelists, and they talk about vision. Vision is very important. But as Dr. JOUR already mentioned, as also my remark also mentioned, we already moved to that directions. And so the only, I agree with that student, if they can start from small, like Edinboro Green New Deal, that would be great. I don't know how many of you really take time to read this Green New Deal. Can you make a guess how many words in that bill? Just make a quick guess. 6,000. I'm sorry. 1,984 words. It's really short bills. So when I'm reading that, I see goals, but I'm the practical person and practical economist. I saw it, I said, where's the money come from? It's pushing a joint, as I mentioned, the economists will try to best allocate the scarce resource. And in this whole bill, I didn't see, they realized we had a scarce resource, didn't see the detailed solutions. They just mentioned about the goals. All the goals are great, but what would be the practical steps? I didn't see that. But if we really can, starting from the Edinboro Green New Deal, and we actually can push back, tell them what should we do, how we execute those, how we execute to achieve those goals. So.
Cool. I'd first like to apologize. The only panelist whose name I know is Dr. Jenlin, but this is to all the panelists. The panelists on the far left, you brought up the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, earlier, and I'd just like to say I do know a bit about that because my one great uncle was in the CCC, and my other great uncle fought in Korea. One planted trees for money, and the other died in a swamp for money. And the similarity is they were both technically under the command of the Army. I know that the CCC was under the command of Douglas MacArthur. So my question to all the panelists is, do you think that the only way to really get these big, broad, quick changes that we need is to make this a national security issue? Because I think like New York and like Miami going underwater is like a national security issue, and make it a military operation, just like how the CCC was. And Dr. Jenlin, specifically, do you think if you framed it like that, that the Green New Deal is Army strong and it supports our troops? Do you think that could bring over some conservative voters?
Interesting.
Well, just real quickly, it is a national security issue, and the Defense Department recognizes it as such. The DoD has been active in trying to figure out the effects of climate change on security policy for a long time. Not just because the glaciers are melting and therefore the Russians can now sail their ships through the North Pole area that they couldn't do 25 years ago, but also the effects on things like population and access to water, the kinds of wars that are going to be fought, the ability of the United States to project its power around the world depending on sea levels and so on. It's very much a national security issue, and they already know it.
So, go ahead. Yeah, actually, your question remind me, we have 2 Energy Acts. So one is in 2005 called Energy Acts, and another one in 2007. They actually called Energy Independent and Security Acts. So one of the interesting part for this act, they actually pushing the ethanol forward. So if you go to a gas station, you have 10% ethanol mixed with your gasoline. So you know ethanol is clean energies. So I think that bill they sell pretty well is they put the national security as one reason to pushing that clean energy forward. So that's actually a very interesting idea.
I'm not going to really respond to the question, except it reminded me, I don't know, since there's so many college students in the audience, do you realize that we have something that is similar in some respects to the Civilian Conservation Corps in the United States today? It's called AmeriCorps. Mm-hmm. And so they hire college students in the summertime, and they hire college graduates doing all kinds of good work, conservation work, social science work, war on poverty work, education work, all around the country, and the government pays a stipend, and they give you a little cash award at the end of that time to help pay down your student loans or to put it towards going to graduate school. So AmeriCorps.com, just thought I would advertise for the modern version of that.
My only response to your question, which has really given me pause to think, so I'm going to request more time to really think about how I would respond to that, but I will say that it causes me concern when we talk about militarizing things that we shouldn't have to militarize, things that are common sense. Social justice, it's about life, right? It's about your children and what kind of conditions your children are going to live under if we don't do something, and do it fairly quickly. So, good question. Thank you.
Yeah, there's so much that can be said. I just want to make a comment about the political scene. The Republican Party, it was Nixon who started the Environmental Protection Agency, and Bush 1 said, "I'll be your environmental president." So yes, Karen, you said it isn't a political issue. Well, it shouldn't be, is what you really meant. But it has become one because the Republican Party has bailed out on it. they've gone through an evolution. Yes, first, no climate change. It's not happening. Second, it's happening, but not human caused. And third, it's human caused, but there's nothing that we can do about it. But they have gone absolutely south on this. And I mean, I'm trying to be neutral here, but I think there is an argument that the Republican Party has gone off the rails in the last 20 years. Not because of any particular policy, but just because of their unwillingness to deal with something called truth. And it's a sad thing. And if you want to, I have documentation on, for example, other campaigns, but I think that's the headwaters that you face. There's so much lying and propaganda. And you you all know the story about the frog in lukewarm water, and that's where we are. I think when it becomes a real emergency and millions of people are fleeing Bangladesh, you say, "What's that to me?" Well, it will become something to you, and but then it's too late. So I'm sort of pessimistic. I don't think humans evolved to handle this kind of thing. If I throw a rock at you, you'll duck, but anything gradual, we can't even see it. Sorry. Well, I just wanted to have a reaction to that. Some of you that I'm really asking for a reaction. Am I wrong to be pessimistic? That's my question.
Do you have a thought about it?
Okay, my response is, and I've always loved this statement that Jesse Jackson used to use, and that was, keep hope alive. And I think it's important to not give up hope. But I hear what you're saying, because we do have issues. Because if we didn't, this would have been fixed. They would be addressing this now. We wouldn't need to have these kinds of conversations. But I believe that as an individual, I have to keep hope in me about the fact that there will be positive change at some point. I may not see it, but I hope Lydia will see it. She's sitting right behind you. So I hope a younger generation will see positive change. And maybe it will take them to change it, because we don't seem to be willing to.
I think that you said in somewhat ideological terms what I tried to say in kind of academic terms, which is that if you don't make it personal for people, if they don't see the rock coming at them, then they don't feel the need to duck. If you tell them there's going to be a rock 5 years from now, why should they duck now? You need to figure out how to get people to duck now, or to get someone to stop throwing them. I mean, you need to make it real for people. And that's something that neither party has been able to do, and I don't think the Green New Deal does that. I don't know that the Republican Party has gone off the rails in that, but I do think that the voters the voters who tend to vote Republican, conservative voters, are much more likely to value things like individualism, individuality, and so on, that make them less likely to support a collective solution to these kinds of problems.
First things first, thank you all for being here. This has been a very interesting panel and interesting talk. But we can all agree that we want to reach more greener energy, reduce climate change. The problem is going to be there's going to be two paths to go down that route. The government can do it for us, or we can have the individual do it as well. My question is for you, for all four, is how, I don't hear a lot of people talk about, it was mentioned earlier, I forget which panelist mentioned subsidies for companies doing more greener practices. The issue is, I hardly ever hear that. Every argument I'm so used to hearing, I hear more and more often, which concerns me as a citizen, is to push for more government, more taxation to provide for it. Whereas with a subsidy, maybe I can give you money and we can put it back into the system. Whereas that tax doesn't quite work the exact same. And so my concern is, why isn't there more push for these green business practices as opposed to the push for a much bigger government?
Good question.
Well, yeah, that's a good question, and as I said earlier, I think that there is more of that than there used to be, and why there isn't more? Well, people don't like change. People don't want things to change. As long as Dr. Jennings said, as long as the status quo is maintained and I'm comfortable, then it's not going to affect me. So why should I worry about it? But we need to look to the future and think about how it's going to affect the next generation and the generation after that. So
I have two general thoughts. One just a general comment, and one a only partially formed thought, because you just brought it up and triggered it for me. But the one is, it doesn't have to be either top down or bottom up. It needs to be both. And earlier when I was talking about the aging infrastructure and the need to make decisions to replace that, I wasn't saying we're going to do that and not work in our communities. But as I had mentioned when I was giving my initial comments, the residential sector is only responsible for 5% of fossil fuel emissions. And so in our households, as individuals, there's a limited amount of stuff that we can do. And some of the stuff, like making decisions about the energy grid, is too big for an individual. It's too big for a small town like Edinboro to take on. So sometimes we need the government to help us with something that's a little bit too big, but we need to work from the bottom up. The second thing is, I just had this thought, and so I'm going to throw this out there, and people will disagree or fix it or whatever. But so there's been some comments here about how loose the Green New Deal is, that it's very vague and broad and it's not specific. I think one of our problems has been that we've been very specific. You know, the EPA might come out and say, okay, you can only emit a certain amount of pollution, and once you get over that, there's a penalty. Or maybe the government comes out and they say, okay, if you're going to put some particulates up into the atmosphere, you have to put this pollution control device, some kind of stack scrubber, you must put that on there. And when we over mandate, that's probably not the right word, when we over specify the regulation, we actually limit the ability for new and creative solutions. So sometimes it's kind of good to have something like a carbon tax, you know, that can be maybe traded on the market, and then let the savvy businesses figure out how to reduce the amount of a pollutant and maybe sell some of their rights to pollute to somebody else who, because of the nature of their industry, has more trouble. So my point is, that's not fully formed, is that, you know, maybe the problem has been in the past that we've over-specified, and maybe it's better to just, you know, have some goals and kind of let the marketplace figure out how to get to the level we're looking for.
So I think your question is more like when the government should actually play a role to do something. Am I correct?
Yeah, my concern may have the government play too big a role.
Yeah.
Or kind of overreach. Do you understand what I mean?
Yes. And so I understand, usually I grew up in China. I know if government too powerful, it's not cool. And so, but my point here is, so what is the right amount of power should coming from the government? So actually it's back to economic questions. So usually you let people making their own decision, business had interaction with the consumers, but there is one big problem here is called asymmetric information or unbalanced power. So business have more information than us, and or the business has more power than the consumer. So that's the point the government should jump in and say, I have to push a little bit further. Like you said, we have to be very careful to using that power, because the goal for the government is not jump in to help to replace the business and the consumer to making the decision. Instead, he is trying to help over the burden to solving the asymmetric information or try to balance the power. And so I think that's how I answer the question.
Next question from the audience.
I noticed that the Green New Deal was being defended as an investment as opposed to an expenditure. But where exactly is the return coming from on the Green New Deal, on the investment?
I'm not a business person, but I'm just going to mention that I think in the Green New Deal, the thought is that we would have a transition into a different energy economy, you know, and other things, and that would bring some jobs and some job growth. And I think that sometimes I think climate change it's going to bring about really bad things, and if we don't spend some investment now to take care of some things, it's going to cost more in the long run. So I think that the payoff is, in part, holding the carbon dioxide concentration at a level that's going to limit warming, average global warming, to that 2 degrees C or below. But idealistically, if we switch our efforts from fossil fuels into renewables, there's going to be job growth and stuff like that. So, just like all investments, you kind of hope for. I don't know the words. I'm going to just sit back. Anyway, pay now or pay later.
So I think talking about investment, I believe some of the audience will think that's a spending instead of investment, and some will think that's investment or instead of a spending. So what's the difference? So when you talk about investment, you are looking for the future cash flow. So you put the money down, you are waiting for future generation that will pay back. And also depends on your interest rate or discount rate. So if you don't value futures, and so your investment will be zero, right? So you don't, that's what we talk about, are you care about future generations? So in this generation, if we decide we do care about future generations, and we do have future cash flow generates, and we can discount back, so that's the value, we will value this, whatever proposing this Great New Deal, whether it's a good investment or not. So we are looking for the future cash flow.
And I would say the exact same thing, except in political terms, which is that not every investment has a cash payback. Not every investment that you put money in gives you money back. Investment in your health, for example, and that's what these goals are. They may require money invested now, but the payoff isn't going to be in your pocket. It's going to be overall environment, quality of life, and so on, and maybe a little bit in your pocket also. At least that's the idea.
If the U.S. were to implement the New Deal, is it enough to reduce global warming as a whole, or is it something that we need to get other countries involved in? And then how do we go about doing that?
There are other countries involved in it. The Paris Accord, I don't know what the number of countries is. I'm like channeling 198. Does anybody know? 198 countries in the world, something like that, signed the Paris Accord. Is that right? 195, okay. 190-ish countries in the world, including the United States at that time, and now we've backed out, and we're really just one of a very small handful of countries that have backed out of that. But probably and that Paris Accord, as well as this Green New Deal, don't specify carbon dioxide emission levels. Like, they don't have actual numbers in there, and it's non-binding. The Green New Deal would be, it's a resolution, it's non-binding, and just the international agreement, the Paris Accord, is also non-binding. So definitely other countries should do it. In the Green New Deal, if you read it, one of the things that they say in the beginning of this is that the U.S., over the history of industrialization of the United States as a country, historically they're responsible for about, I think it's something like 20% of the carbon dioxide emissions, and so we have a responsibility to do something about it. But we certainly expect other countries as well, and I think we have to take into consideration rapidly industrializing countries like China. But China's becoming a world leader in wind and solar, and if the United States does not step into this marketplace, there's other countries, Germany and lots of other countries that are, establishing these renewable energy industries that are going to leave us in their dust. So I don't know if I answered your question, because I started to and then I went off. Do you want to?
Just a fact check, I guess.
Okay.
The Paris Agreement, it was signed by 175 parties.
I was way off.
It's 174 countries and the European Union.
Okay.
So there's some numbers.
Well,
any more questions that we?
Well, can I just add a few words to that real quick?
Yes.
The rest of the developed world is way ahead of the United States on environmental protection. In Japan, recycling is mandatory You get fined if you throw away the wrong thing in the wrong place. In Europe, they have cars that get 50, 60 miles to the gallon and so on. I mean, these societies don't have America's traditions and America's culture in a lot of ways, but they're way ahead of the United States on that particular issue.
Yeah, I want just follow Dr. Jelen said. So it's really who really feel that scarce resource. So Japan limited land, and the population is they are decreasing a little bit, but they have limited land. The same Europe, small land, but U.S. we have much bigger land, and we have relatively smaller population. So we don't feel that urgent. So that's why we are debating here. And as we talk about China, Japan, and also European countries, they already take actions. But I like your question because there is a little bit risky in that because we try to, in the Green New Deal, they said hope we will lead this momentum. But in terms of whether we will generate this called the bandwagon effect, we don't know. So we hope we can do it. So that's what they are proposing. Don't pointing finger to other countries why you are not doing that.
But I agree completely about the bandwagon effect, and I just remember the second part of your question. The United States generates about 20% of global GDP, 20% of the global economy. So if the United States were, in fact, to do great things with the environment and Green New Deal, the rest of the world would follow. I mean, they would almost have no choice but to react to what the United States does, if it could do it.
So I want to make this conversation a little more uncomfortable and go back to your question, young man with the cap on. Why people and corporations and government maybe aren't doing more? Well, maybe they're waiting for the disaster to happen so they can then capitalize on it. It's something called disaster capitalism, put forth by Naomi Klein in her work of 2006 called The Shock Doctrine. Read it.
Next question.
It's very interesting. I just
Me
wanna read
again.
it. Yeah.
So
I'm sorry.
this kind of was brought by all the panelists. Do you think instead of like kind of presenting it in these like broad statements to people like we need to do this or else your grandchild will die in an inferno or something, do you think like a better way is to try to just kind of convince people on their more basic material needs? Like I always hear every election about the coal miners. Do you think if there was the right politician, if they convinced the coal miners, it would be better for you to go outside and make a windmill instead of staying in this coal mine and getting black lung and having your Blue Cross Blue Shield pay for none of your, treatment? Like, do you think that is an effective way to get this passed? Like to more focus on people's more material wants, like focusing more on an economic thing than actual as global warming or climate change?
Do you mind? Can I talk first?
No, you're not allowed.
I'm sorry. But there's a couple of things that there's ways to get people to do things, and there's two of them that I don't think work very well. One is to have the government tell people what to do, and the other is to try to convince people, hey, this is the right thing for you to do. We should all just get along. This is your issue too. Those things don't work. The thing that works is to incentivize people to do things. Give them a reason to do it that works for them, whether it's tax cuts or profit or something else, in the United States anyway. In Japan, you have sort of a collective feeling, and in Europe, you have something else that helps people do the right thing. But in the United States, you need to incentivize people to do something. You need to show them that it affects them personally. And until we have that kind of approach to these issues, I don't see anything happening with it.
Okay, it looks like we have time for one more question, if we have one from the audience, before we wrap up with our panelists. So do we have any more questions? All right.
So as you mentioned, there are these environmental policies in other countries that are working, that are incentivizing the people that live in those countries. And I'm talking specifically to the right end of the panel. It kind of seems like, yes, it seems like you don't think that's going to work in the United States. And as you said, we have to incentivize people. Do you think it's a generational thing? Like you've mentioned the young people in the room, how we kind of have this idea and we grasp it and we understand it, but there's people that don't. So why are they working in other countries and why aren't they going to work here? And is it a generational thing?
The short answer is that it's a cultural thing, and in the United States, where we celebrate individualism, individuality, and so on, we don't have the responses that they do in Japan, where they celebrate the collective, and in Europe, where they have other things. In Japan, they don't have to incentivize people. They just tell people this is good for everybody, and then everybody wants to do that. We don't have that here. So that's why I think here you need to incentivize people. You don't have that in Europe. You don't have that in Japan. Did I just answer your question or avoid it? I'm not sure. I mean, it's the American culture. And the American culture has made America great in so many different ways, and now, at least as far as this is concerned, stands in the way.
I want to add one word. It doesn't consider as an American thing. If you get a chance to look at behavior economics, so it's not just about American. Actually, we have economic theory. They do experiment on human behaviors. They do found that giving incentive is more effective than punishing people. Think about, you always like get raised in the salary, right? So if somebody said, "Oh, we're going to cut you $10 off," you can say, "No, I'm going to quit my jobs." So that's kind of not just about your generation, not just about the American. I think it's kind of like the trend is we have economic theory to support it.
And that was the second thing was, I agree. The second thing was generational. Absolutely, there are generational shifts. If you asked the generation from the 1960s what the most important thing was to them, and they did, and that's why I know this, the young people said it was to develop a meaningful philosophy of life. By the 1980s, it was to get a good job and make a lot of money. What is it now? I don't know, but generations do shift, and young conservatives do support action on climate change, as well as a lot of other things, and they are pulling the Republican Party to the left in that regard. So it can't change.
Okay, before we wrap up, we have a little time for each panelist to make one final thought before we conclude our uncomfortable conversations for the academic year. Everyone's looking at you, Dr. Jenlin, so I think you're first.
I think I gave all my final thoughts already. I don't think anybody is against doing something. I just think that people don't know what the right thing to do is and don't know how to bring it about. And to reiterate what I said, I don't think that anything that is associated with the far left stands a chance of passing and convincing people who are just automatically turned off by anything the far left has to say. I think that rather than having, who was it, Ed Markey? I want to say ACL because somebody tore it. No,
AOC.
AOC. Rather than having people who identify themselves as socialist or far left propose these things, you've got to bring conservatives on board from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. That's the way to get these things done, and then it won't be such anathema to people.
So my final remark is I hope I can bring up another level. So this is the reason we're debating here, because everything we are debating here is related to the scarce resource. And so what would be the best way to solving this scarce resource issue? That is technology advance. So we have so many young people sitting here, and you are the future, and you will be very creative, create new technology. So you actually will be the one to solve the problem and ending our debates here, because the advanced technology will help us to extending the limits of the resource.
Well, I was going to come back to not technology, but the young people thing. So I wanted to come back to something Ed had mentioned earlier about not having, like pessimistic viewpoint. But my hope is standing in a classroom 9 months of the year with young people from a wide spectrum of life who all really care about the world that they're inheriting and want to make a big difference in it. So you guys bring me a lot of hope when I'm feeling down, and so I hope that there is a generational shift and you will bring about the change. And I think that even with Alexandra, oh my God, now you've got me, Ocasio-Cortez, right? AOC, right? People, it seems to me like people in the conservative media like to vilify her far more than she deserves. I think she's young and she's smart, and I don't think that everything she says is super far out there, and we already live in a social democracy. We've got public education, we've got public highways, we've got a lot of public stuff as well as private stuff, so I don't think that she's out there. So I'm hoping you guys can kind of come together and find a way to change things. So technology, but also just some other kinds of political and behavioral change and acceptance, you know, and having society learn to talk amidst their differences, their political differences or religious differences or whatever. So you guys bring me a lot of hope. That's my final word.
So I have two final words. My first one is just a statement of appreciation. I want to acknowledge my student researcher, Nicole Heitzenrotter, who's, raise your hand back there. She did significant research for me on this subject. About half of the 10 pages of notes that I have, she did. So I want to acknowledge her contribution to this. And I also want to say that you need to get involved. We need to get involved. We sit back and we talk and we moan and groan about, who's going to change this? We're going to change it. Not just the young people. I agree with everything that's said about young people. You're the future. But those of us who are older, not old, but older, need to help. We need to get involved too, and we need to support people being engaged. And I'm going to put in a plug. Fisher, don't shoot me. Lydia Lath, who's sitting on the second row, is a young person who's actively engaged in local politics. She's running for the Washington Township Council. So that's something that you can do. Vote. Run for office. Get involved. There are all kinds of organizations around that will provide opportunities for people to be involved. So that's my last word.
Can we get a round of applause for our panelists tonight? All right. Thank you for attending our final uncomfortable conversation of the academic year. We've covered some great topics. If you know of any that you would like us to cover in future sessions or next academic year, feel free to email them to Dr. Fisher. His email address is jdfisher@edinboro.edu, or you can look him up on our directory. So one more round of applause, and everybody else have a good night.